Welcome to 20-Side Adventures, continuing my tier list. This time we're going to be discussing weapon runes, so hang tight, we're going to get through those. But first, if you haven't subscribed yet, we would appreciate a sub to the channel, and if you like the content I'm putting out, always appreciate the like. Without too much more shilling, let's get right into it. Alright, we're going to start right off with Fanged. Possibly the worst rune you could put on a weapon. It's if you weren't a druid, but you really want to be a druid. I personally do not understand this rune. If you're a big fan of it, I'd love to hear in the comments what the heck its purpose is. But sticking a weapon in my mouth to turn into a random animal, I can think of 10,000 better things to do with my gold and actions. Next up, Authorize C tier. I like the theme of it. Only you can use your weapon. I don't know how useful it really is for general play, but I could definitely see some good stuff with it. Next up, Crushing, S tier. If you have a hammer weapon, you need to take Crushing. You get basically a free crit specialization that gives you 2 debuffs, so S tier, fantastic choice for anyone using a Crushing bludgeoning weapon. C tier, Underwater. Unless your campaign is involving the water a lot, no real need to ever take this. It lets you use your weapon underwater without penalty. Returning, S tier if you are a thrown weapon person. If you are throwing weapons as your primary mode of combat, must take. Comes right back to you. You don't have to have a wide variety of knives. You always get your favorite knife back. Merciful, D tier. I don't understand spending the rune slot on Merciful. There's just, you can get a sap and do your thing. If you're really worried about killing someone, or you have a character arc where Merciful would be purposeful, go ahead and take it. I also like it as a thematic thing that pretty much all training weapons probably have Merciful on them in large kingdoms and any real standing army, so I think there's a lot of great story fluff. I just don't think it's a good player choice. Ghost Touch, C tier. If you need to fight incorporeal creatures, definitely grab Ghost Touch. It's a cheap solution to the problem, and since you can mix and match and swap runes, having a few Ghost Touch runes kicking around in the team vault is definitely not a bad thing to do. Bane, B tier. Some extra damage against a specific creature type. If you're hunting very specific creatures or your campaign is revolving around something very specific, Bane can be a great choice. Earthbind, C tier. If you're fighting a lot of flying creatures, can be super useful. I just think it's very niche. You'll also have to pardon me if I'm clearing my throat a lot. It is springtime and allergy season on the farm here is driving me nuts. D, Cunning. I just don't really respect recall knowledge in a fight to begin with, so having it on a weapon that does it once I've already hit something, I like it even less. Hooked, B tier. This is only a good choice if you already are using a hooked weapon because it gives you a reaction to attempt a trip, which because it's a reaction would not have your multiple attack penalty, so it gives you a good trip, assuming you don't have other things you'll commonly be doing with your reaction. If you have a tripping weapon and the hooked rune, it's a great combo. Pacifying. Very interesting, -2 penalty on anyone you hit unless they're doing non-lethal damage. So that's kind of cool, and it can also be very thematic to where you're convincing your enemies to surrender. As a GM, I can see a player using this very frequently and having some very good use. If you don't do that aspect of it, the -2 to not all lethal attacks is pretty solid. Vitalizing, C tier. It's a good choice if you're fighting a lot of undead. Otherwise, there's better things to take to get a damage boost on your weapon. Fearsome, A tier, a free Frightened 1 for hitting something, not a bad option. Demolishing, like Vitalizing, if you're fighting a lot of constructs, it's a good option. Hauling, terrible choice. Once per hour, uses your reaction, you get to push people around the battlefield once per hour. Not worth the gold. Shifting, this one I like. It lets your weapon change what kind of weapon it is, so if you're fighting creatures that maybe only take bludgeoning damage, you have a sword, suddenly your sword becomes a hammer. Could be very useful if you're moving between a wide variety of creatures with a lot of resistances. Energizing. I think this is D tier because if you are taking damage from an elemental source, it is most likely the thing you will be hitting has resistance to that same element. So I don't find it very useful. On the other hand, we have Conducting, B tier, has a lot of good synergies with some other classes. I don't know if it's a great take for just a fighter, but like the Alchemist with an alchemical crossbow and the Conducting rune, you load in your alchemical bomb to the crossbow, giving it, let's say, fire damage, free action Conducting. Now you get more fire damage on top of that. Boom, shoot your crossbow. B tier, I don't think it's the best, but certain builds you can definitely make Conducting be very useful. Wounding, B tier, solid choice. You want to give some bleed damage on a target. Next up, slightly not appearing on this screen, called better than the accessory rune technically, though I think, as I pointed out in my accessory video, being able to play with that accessory rune slot on a weapon might be a good option for this, but if your weapon's taken from you, you're taken prisoner, someone disarms you, call your weapon back even if they're holding it, you can regain control of your weapon. C tier could have a purpose. I think there's better takes, but if it's thematic for your character, by all means. Next up, Death Drinking. A rune that gives you saves to effects from negative and positive energy. That's super good. Gives you some extra damage on a crit. That works both directions, so you can hurt dead or undead, or living and undead. And then also a really good reaction to when you slay a foe to give yourself a bonus on attacks coming up. I think this is a great choice. And it's just really dark and grim. I like the thematics of it. Flurrying, A tier for monks only, so everyone else D tier, you gotta have flurry. But it lets you take that second flurry and reach out and hit someone else if you happen to slay the person in front of you, and it lets you also summon a spiritual weapon that can do flurrying and has some better options. So I just think there's some great builds in here for a monk. Rooting, B tier. When you crit something, you lock them down in place. Can be super useful. Astral. So I think this is the better version of Ghost Touch. You still get all the benefits of Ghost Touch with a little bit of spirit damage, and spirit damage tends to hurt most things. Giant Killing, C tier. As it states, gives you bonuses for killing giants. If you're not fighting giants, not super useful. So again, not appearing on this screen. I'm not sure why this pushed off so much for me, but Corrosive. Solid amount of damage. When you're attacking shielded creatures with shields, you're going to be breaking through their shields a lot sooner. For every other monster, you're going to be annoying your DM as they have to go and figure out hardness and hit points for armor, because nothing else really in the game allows you to destroy armor but corrosive. So great for breaking shields. Your DM will hate you. Decaying, slightly better than demolishing, really good against constructs. Again, pretty niche, C tier. Flaming, A tier. If you want a damaging rune, Flaming is by far one of the best. Occasionally, if you hit those things that are immune to fire, it's going to be problematic unless you get to the greater tier with all of these elemental runes, then they get to ignore that, or at least the resistances. So, but Flaming, by far, a good choice if you just want some extra damage. You're going to get the D6 as well as persistent damage on the crits. Solid take. Frost, similar to Flaming, same damage, but instead of the persistence, you're going to get slowed. They do have a save on the slow, but anytime you can take an action from an opponent, I think it's a great choice. Shock, not that great. It lets you AoE damage up to 2 creatures near your target that you crit. If there's no one there, it's a wasted critical effect, so B tier. Thundering, its debuff is Deafening. I just don't think Deafening is that impactful in combat, so B tier. Ashen, this one's pretty cool. So you are going to have persistent damage as well as a pretty solid debuff from it. I could even see a reading where you have to re-roll the save with each round of the persistent damage. I know that's not really how it's supposed to work from some other wording, but I could see the argument being made at a table. So something to think about, GMs and players, if you're taking Ashen. Coding. I think Coding is a great rune if you have an alchemist in the party who's making lots of poisons and oils. Sometimes that extra action to add them into combat just doesn't happen. This lets you store your oil and poison in an interdimensional space and load it onto your weapon. So it's a good way to use some of those other things. If you don't have an alchemist in party, maybe not as great of a take, unless you have someone that's doing crafting a lot, or you just have a lot of gold to spend on consumables. Extending, solid choice for melee fighters. Reach out and touch someone with your dagger without having to throw it. Just gives you some good range options. It does take 2 actions, but if you can't reach someone, well, no, you can't. Grievous, perhaps one of the best takes for a melee fighter on your weapon. You already have crit specialization, as presumably. Now you get more crit specialization, and they can be pretty devastating. So I think Grievous is by far one of the best rune takes you could have. Swarming, if you are a thrown weapons combatant, why would you not want to turn your thrown weapon into a cone? 100% S tier, take this if you're throwing weapons. Anchoring, D tier, with the exception if you're fighting creatures that jump planes a lot, because you might want to keep them here so you can finally end them. So super niche, could be good for the swapping into your weapon and out as the situation arises, but general use anchoring, not very useful. Impactful. So this one kind of does what Hauling does, but better. So it's force damage, and you can push targets when you crit them. Serrating. Sounds so cool, just isn't. The extra actions it takes to get the higher damage dice just aren't worth it, in my opinion. Holy and Unholy, B tier, decent damage. At least they will hurt other things and double up when they're against their opposites. Their critical effect, though, being a reaction, just really takes them down from being A tier because I just don't think they work out in the action economy in the long run. Brilliant, S tier. Arguably, I just have a soft spot for Brilliant, so I put it in S. It gives you a wide variety of bonus damage to a bunch of different creatures, and if they somehow all hit the Venn diagram, you're doing a lot of damage. Can also blind on a crit, which is pretty solid. Realistically, it's probably A tier, but I just love the thematics of a Brilliant weapon, so it's S tier because this is my tier list. Animated, this could be super useful as a secondary weapon, even maybe combining it with a throne build, and you throw it out there and then the weapon starts working on its own, and it basically gives you free actions to do extra damage. So anything that boosts your action economy can be super useful. It does require the investment because it shouldn't be your primary weapon, because then you won't have a weapon because it's off doing its own thing. So A tier for that fact, but otherwise it's a really good choice. Spell Reservoir. B tier, if you have a good mage in your party, you could maybe use this to your advantage and have the right spell loaded up for the right moment in the coming combat. But basically, it lets you be a magus for one round when you aren't a magus. Keen, S tier. Why wouldn't you want to crit on 19s as if they were 20s? No brainer. Absolutely take Keen. Shockwave, C tier. You get to do splash damage with your melee hammer and hurt all of your friends that you're fighting alongside. Yeah, I don't think the splash damage is worth it, and it doesn't do enough damage to offset the downsides of it. Next up, Bloodthirsty, A tier. So this one gives you a reaction when you down an opponent, you get temporary hit points. When you crit, it's going to do persistent bleed damage and the drained effect. So that's a super good debuff when you're critting your opponents. A tier choice. Next up, Vorpal, B tier. I love the thematics of Vorpal. If you're going to go fight a Jabberwock, absolutely take a Vorpal. Has a chance of just ending your foe anytime you crit. The downside is I feel at the level you're getting Vorpal, the fortitude save is like fails on 2s, 3s, so the likelihood of Vorpal proccing is very low. I just don't think it's worth the cost. If you get a Vorpal weapon, absolutely keep it. Fantastic. I don't know if I would spend the money and go out of my way to get one, however, unless you were fighting Jabberwocks. And lastly, the most expensive rune you can get in the game, the Impossible Weapon, and it's terrible. Twice as much as any other rune. It lets you negate attack penalties, accept your multiple attack penalty, gives you that teleport to hit. I don't know. For the cost, I just think it is a lot to do about nothing. If it took away your multiple attack penalty as well, I would boost this up, but it doesn't. I don't see folks getting that heavily debuffed to where the Impossible Rune would be something I'd want to take for level 20 and the price point. Yeah, I just think it's super lackluster, and there's just way better choices. Oh, and somewhere in there in my clicking, I forgot Quick Stride up there with Keen. So when that one comes up, however long ago it was, S tier, getting a free haste action. Why wouldn't you want it? It has to be to strike, but even still, anything that lets you maximize your action economy is worth it. So there you guys have it. That's my tier list. I didn't include the dwarf specific ones in here. If you have a dwarf clan dagger, they're all decent takes for the clan dagger. And then the ancestral knowledge one for dwarves, where it lets you boost another weapon's proficiency level to your highest, can be a solid choice if you're using some strange weaponry you're not familiar with. But didn't feel they fit in this because they were so niche to dwarf things in Galarian. So there you guys have it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Again, if you haven't, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time in your 20-side adventures.